Hey everybody, this is a quick lecture on Class 14 and Chapter 9, which covers forms. Now, I like to give you the whole view of this and how the back end would receive the data, but forms are probably the most important thing that you're going to learn, and it's something that is a make or break. It's the way people communicate with the client through form data. So you're going to want to see this and understand how to use which input type at which time. So let's get started. So in this section right here, you see several text fields. You see a name, a company, address line 1, address line city, address line 2, city, state, zip, and country. So the types of controls you see in front of you right now, you see mostly text inputs. That's what name, company, address line 1, address line 2, city. Those are all input type equals text. Now the drop downs are the ones with the little carrots you see in the top right, and that means when the user clicks there, you'll see a drop down of offerings. Then you see zip code, more text inputs, and then you see a web search. So our job is to make this the most usable way possible of getting data from our users to our client. So initially when I look at this, I can tell you a couple things. The Nielsen-Norman group, who are usability experts, recommend no more than 6 fields in a form. So I'll push this if you have me for a class on ground. But if you have the zip code, you don't need city and state. Okay. And I'd also point out that address line 2 is generally confusing for a lot of people. So you could make general address line 1 a little bit larger and use something called a text area. So what we're focusing on here is we get text box, check radio box, something like that, drop down list and buttons, but there's even more. So I want you to think when you look at this, ask yourself how usable it is. Have you ever been frustrated with this? For example, the continue and clear all buttons are on the left. They probably should be on the right based on the research of Fitz and Fitz's law, which says that we work a form top left, lower right. That's the Western world. So you can look at any form and kind of give feedback on it, whether you think it's usable or not. And that's a big deal. So 2 components of the form. You've got the HTML form that takes the data, sort of the quarterback, if you will, if you're familiar with football, American football. And then you've got the wide receiver, which is catching the football, or the data. So in line 2, we have the server-side processing script, which will maybe take the data and send an email out, maybe write it to a text file, maybe update a database. More than likely it'll be number 3 there, updates a database, or performs some other type of processing. Now in this curriculum, PHP is generally the server-sided script that will be receiving this information, and it handles it very well. So the information must be processed through something. Now PHP is in red here because it's literally 80% of the servers out there that we know. But you can add Python to this list, but everything you see in front of you is a server-sided script. So these are the recipients of the form data. Now, here's a good example of a typical form, where if we have input type text name equals fname, it would be Andrew. So everything you see here on the left, on the right side of the screen, in this section right here, this whole row or column is the name attribute of its input type. So in first name, it would be input type equals text, name equals fname, and then you'd have name equals lname. And you have name equals address 1, name equals address 2. So that's how PHP or any server-sided script would grab that data. It knows the value of the input type name. So once the data is sent to the server, we can use some sort of server-sided scripting language to actually echo out a response or print out a response. And that's what this is, this diagram. So on typical email sign-up list, you'd have the input name and an email. You would submit it. The data would be sent in key value pairs, name equals and email equals this. And the web application would take that data and probably insert it into a database so that when the mailing list got created, that server-sided script would call that database and loop through all those names and emails. And within that loop, send the message that they want to get out. So let's talk about this form element. Up at the top here, you have a form name. Name equals XYZ. That makes this form accessible to JavaScript, as does the ID. So if JavaScript, if we use that to validate this form would be accessible to JavaScript. That's why it has a name. The action tells you where the data is being sent. In this case, script.php. The method, and this is very important, is post or get. Post will send the variables invisibly, meaning you don't see those variables at all. However, get will send the variables through the URL window. These are the two most important things about a form, giving it an action and giving it a method. So the thing about get method, and we'll learn about this in other classes, is that if it sends it through the URL window, those values will be cached in the browser. So you never want to use the get method when you're sending private information. So here we go. Post versus get. Data is sent in a separate message if you use post. Basically, it's invisible. And you can send a lot more data than you could if you were sending it through the URL window. Get, data is sent in the header or the URL window. And it's limited to 1,024 kilobytes, which is enough for text. That's plenty for text. It is faster. It's used for search engines that can be bookmarked. However, it will be cached. So something like what you see at the bottom here is mailinglist.php question mark name equals Sally. The %20 is a space. Strong arm is the last name. And that's the queuing up the next pair of variables. The email is equal to strong arm at, that's what the %40 is, example.com. So here you have key value pairs being sent through the get method. But the issue with this is that it is going to be cached. So name Sally, strong arm equals email. That is all going to be cached in the browser. So that means we're giving away the user's name and email address. So something like this, I would want a post method. Okay, so text box naming form elements. Here we go. The name attribute in any input type is what the server reads. The IDs, those are for JavaScript and CSS. So the value of this would be what the user enters. So let me go back to this. Oh, we get the same. One second here. There we go. Back. There we go. So these name value pairs, again from the previous slide, just as a reminder, would be input type text, name equals fname, and the value is Andrew, as is the same with lname, address1, and address2. So the label element. The label will associate a text label with a form control. So when you see something like this, if the user clicks on anything in that label, if the user clicks on anything in this label, that cursor will go into this text field. This is very important when we talk about radio buttons and checkboxes. So we have, in this case, input type text name equals email. Then we have label for email, and in this case I would make it input type equals email, name equals email. If you make input type equal to email, then it will call up the keyboard for email if the user is using mobile, which means you'll have an @ symbol, a dot, and some keyboards .com, .edu, etc. So the type is the type attribute here, and again, for just general input elements, use text. But you can use mail, you can use or email, you can use tel for telephone. You can use a lot of these things, and what it will do is for mobile, those devices that understand those types, it will pull up the appropriate keyboard. Okay, so if you need a large amount of text, use a text area. And the tags here are what's shown, text area, and it has a closing tag as well. And this will take columns and rows. So if you want to make it wider, you'll add the columns, and if you want to make it taller, you'll add the rows. Now, input type password. This is when you see your password here, and you don't see it at all. You see the asterisks. Now, as far as your portfolios and making yourself look good, there's some really cool JavaScripts out there that allow you to type in on each keystroke the actual letter of your password, and you can visually see it for a second, and then use JavaScript to delay and replace it with the asterisk so it's safe. So if you ever take me for JavaScript, we can do it in that class. That's a good one, because it's not only something that's really cool that deters the user from making mistakes, but it's also a talking point in a job interview, meaning you're trying to prevent user error. Okay, so here's a case where we have an input type submit, which is the lower left button, and then we also have an input type reset, and the value is start over. So if you have an input type reset, it will clear all elements in that form. I'm not a fan of using a reset button, I'll be honest with you, especially in this case where the reset is so close to the submit button, it's very dangerous. The user could have all their data filled out and they hit the reset button and they're frustrated. At most, if you're going to have that button be a distance away from the form. All right, time for radio buttons. And these are, when you have a radio group, like what you see here, Mr., Mrs., and Miss, they all have to have the same name attribute. And that means that only one of these three can be clicked. So if I click on Mr. and then click on Mrs., the checkbox on, or the select on Mr. will be removed. There won't be any darkened circle. And its input type equals radio, and the name will be equal to whatever the group name is. And you can have IDs in that, but rarely you don't. Rarely we go by group name. They have to have the same group name in order to have that behavior where only one gets selected. And the value would identify the choice. So this might be this name attribute in a real life scenario might be name prefix, and the value might be Mr., Mrs., and Miss. Okay, so back to the radio buttons. And one thing I want to talk about too. So normally with radio buttons, you'd have a label so that if the user clicked Mr., Mr. would be selected. So if the user clicks, let's say I have input type radio label for Mr., and I have this right here. If they click Mr., then that gets selected. All right, so they are again mutually exclusive. So in this case, we have the same name group XYZ, and if the name is the same values, the values have to be different, which means you can only choose one of these. And this is if you have it checked by default, you use the checked property. So you can use checked. If you look online, you'll see checked equals and checked in quotes, but you can use the shorthand, which is just checked. And then if you were to have the same name and you click this, then regardless of this directive, Mrs. would not be checked once the user initializes another check. And this is an example of checkbox. This acts exactly like the radio buttons, with the one exception that you can do multiples. And it doesn't matter what group name you have. Like if you have, in this case, let's say the name is operating system, and that's the first checkbox. Second checkbox is operating system. Same thing, right? You can have both checked. So the value identifies the choice in each case, and it's up to you, the coder, of what that value will be. So this is the same name, and we have OS here, just like I said, operating system, OS, the name attribute for both, and the values have to be different, otherwise they're going to send the same message. But if we check multiples on this, it would send what's called an array or a list. So that's an important part of this. So if you want multiple items, checkbox. You want singular items, radio. And in this case, we have separate checkboxes, and the names can be completely different. In this case, we wouldn't send multiple arrays. We would send OS1 as being true or false, and OS2 as being true or false. We wouldn't send that list of data. All right, so this is checked with no value. Yeah, if it's checked, it'll return on or true as the value because there is no value here, but XYZ would be on for the server-sided script. A lot of this is, a bit about server-sided scripting, but you want to get good at just the front end. Okay, and this is if we want it checked by default. It's identical to the radio system where you have checkbox and then checked. So that's it. And you see like I said before a few slides ago, you see this checked equals checked with the quotes. That's XHTML. It's gracefully degraded, so it's fine. You can use either one. They're going to work in the last two browsers or versions of browsers. Okay, so here's the dropdown. We have a select name that equals 80s fave and options. These options are going to be the default. So let's say it's option 1, the cure. Okay, notice how there's no value equals the way there is 5 options down. That means what gets sent will be 80s fave equals the cure with the space. But on the option 5 there, if you were to submit that and choose it, it would be 80s fave equals EBTG instead of everything but the girl. So that's how that would work with the dropdown. It's pretty easy. You have a select name, name would be job, and in this case right here, we'd have none, PGMR, or DBM. Those are the values that would be inbound. What the user sees would be please select one, programmer, database manager. Right away, if they load the page, the selected element will be programmer. It's just like the checked property in checkboxes and radio buttons, but that area would be selected. And in this case, we have a size of 6, which is going to control the width, and we have the word multiple. And that means if we can control click on a couple of options, we can do as many as we want. In this case, we've chosen Tears for Fears and Thompson Twins, so the data would come into the server-sided script as a list or an array that would be broken apart by the programming there. However, because dropdowns are a little bit different than checkboxes, it's probably more user-friendly in 2019 to allow checkboxes for a question like this. That way it's completely visual for all. Because right now we only see down to Depeche Mode, we don't see the Smiths, we don't see New Order. And what the user has to do is control-click while scrolling. And that's a lot to ask for the user. But if you throw these into checkboxes, you're good to go. I mean, it's better usability. Okay, so this is a way to group drop-down items. In this case, we have traditional, and you see the label, and you see the word opt group. The opt group tag will separate the vanilla and chocolate for traditional with the fancy. And this is rarely used. You don't see it too much, but if you see this in your portfolio or an opportunity for this, whoever you interview with is going to look at it and go, wow, that's something you don't see too often. And it's organizationally friendly. So, but remember, we could do the same thing with checkboxes. Okay, we could have a big header called traditional with 2 checkboxes, and another big header called fancy, which has the fancy options. Okay, so this is if you want to upload a file. You would send the data to a PHP script method post, but what's important is the encode type. And what this encode type multi-part form data means, it allows you to send anything as an attachment, and that includes images, zip files, text files, PDFs, whatever you want. It basically means open season. It tells the form and the browser to accept any kind of attachment. And at the bottom here you see input type equals file, name equals photo, and the size is the length of that page. Now, it's not often that you even have the size of that being wide, but if you click browse, the name of the file will appear in that text area. So this covers field sets and legend elements. So in this case, I have one field set, meaning we have a collection of input types that relate to the same thing. Now, if you recall from my second slide, I talked about Nielsen-Norman group and how they've put out studies that say that more than 5 input types is generally not good usability. Well, the thing about this is, with the field set, we're allowed to create groups of 5 or less, so it does still achieve good usability. And in this case, we have something called the legend, which is the legend for the entire field set, and it should describe all the elements inside that set. And by default, you'll see these borders. These borders are by default in most browsers. All right, so how do we style our forms? Well, there's a pseudo element called focus, which means once the cursor is inside that text element, we can have a change in style. In this case, I have it for all inputs. You see input, focus. So any kind of input, it's any kind. So if it's input type equals radio, the background would be yellow as soon as you click it. So the focus is the act of actually putting your cursor in that section, and the pseudo class is focus. All right, this is an example of an email box with input type email. And this will only accept text information in a valid email address format. And this is useful all the way back to IE9. So this is going to work, and you should use it because it'll make sure that you have an @ symbol and a dot before a file extension. And this is type URL, and this will only accept something in a valid URL format. So it has to have a domain, a dot, and then a subdomain at the end. And here's an example of the custom keypads that are used when you use that input type equals email, input type equals search, input type equals telephone, and input type equals URL. You see the URL has .com, the TL has the number keypad, search simply has the search box, and email has the @ symbol. Very handy. HTML5 really has come far. All right, this is a data list. So what a data list is, it actually allows you to have data sent that are inside a specific list. And here you see input type equals text, list equals education level, and you're actually able to select those options. So this is another way of passing data, and we'd get name education, and it would be equal to those values. Now, this is a range control, and basically input type equals range, and you see the slider, and it would pass the actual number based on the range. So in my server-sided script, I would be looking for choice equals, and it might be something, it looks like it's about 80 in the screenshot there, but input type range is another nice HTML5 section. So I'm going to go ahead and show you, like, what with these elements, how is the support? I'm not worried about the modern browsers, but how is the support for, let's say, Opera, something like that. And so again, just to review something I did prior, can I use .com? Just go here if you see an input type that looks really friendly and you want to just use this. So let's let it load, and I'm just going to use range. Range input type. And as you can see, everything Opera it works on. So that's a really useful thing. So this in your curriculum, in unison with some JavaScript, is going to allow you to do price sliders for e-commerce. And those are really handy if you want to have an e-commerce sled, you want to have the user enter his or her budget. That would help. Now this is the spinner control, and you have to have an input type number for this. And in this case, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, because it has a min 1 and a max of 10. This is the calendar control, but be very wary about this because it doesn't always look good. If you use input type date here, you'll see that Chrome looks fantastic, but IE doesn't even support it. So that's one of the issues with the date. Now, there are plugins, there's JavaScript plugins that can allow you to gracefully degrade this onto IE, so just keep that in mind. Now, this covers the placeholder attribute, and we have a placeholder here that says first name, and you can see it right in there, but it's in gray. That's a nice way to tell the user what to put in there, and you can actually, it'll actually disappear once the user hits his cursor inside. So in your work, I would expect to see the placeholder attribute because it is good usability. All right, autofocus. So what this means is that when you type the cursor in there, all values are removed and it automatically focuses when the page is loaded. So basically page loads and the cursor will automatically go into the first name element. And lastly, the required attribute. This is an important one because it uses HTML5 validation. When you use required, it's not only going to ask for data to be put in, but it'll actually meet the input type. So by using required, you would use it for telephones, zip codes, emails, anything that's pertinent. And all you have to do is write the word required on it. So now the next step is just see this stuff in use and practice, because it's ultra important in your growth. And it's going to take a little while to learn, but there really are a limited amount of tags. There's input type text, radio button, checkbox, drop down, text area. Those are the most common. And if you master those 5, you're in good shape.